of American culture.
Mr. Shamlin, interview, take one, Mark.
Slavery was the heart of Southern culture, the heart of American culture in many ways too, but certainly Southern culture. I mean, the American South was the richest, wealthiest slave society on earth in the 1850s and 1860s. Indeed, maybe even in history, some have said. So, you cannot think about the Old South without thinking about slavery. The slave South had 3.8 million slaves, right? Enslaved people. That's from the start, tells you something about how important slavery was to the South. And, the American economy relied to a certain extent on cotton and the cotton exports. And cotton was the major export coming from the United States abroad. And that cotton was being produced by enslaved labor. So it's impossible to think of the United States without thinking about slavery. I've got to say, the quality of education when I was in school, and you could go through an entire course of American history and know something about slavery, but not really understand the institution and how important it was and how the institution came to be, how the institution changed, all of that. That's much more central than what it was. There's been a revolution in American historical studies over the last 50 years, really, in the centrality of slavery, which had been denied for a very long time. The Civil War, some said, wasn't fought about slavery, it was fought about states' rights and so forth. And you still hear that out there, which tells you something about the lack of, the shortcomings of secondary education. But I think we've actually gotten much closer to being right than we had before. As I say, slavery underwent about the same time, not coincidentally, the same time the Civil Rights Movement really got going in the 1950s. Historians began to put slavery back at the center of American history where it belongs. And at this point, I don't think that you can get a decent, certainly a college education in history of the United States in that period without having slavery right there. I know that because I teach that period right here at Princeton, and the name of my course is Slavery and Democracy in the New Republic. So it's about those two things, slavery and democracy, how they could coexist, how they became contradictory. That's at the heart of what American history was in that period. And then the consequences of emancipation, the consequences of the war, are still very much with us. I mean, that's not a historical question. That's a political question. So yeah, I mean, slavery. Well, and slavery and race. I mean, the two are connected, obviously. I mean, they're not exactly the same thing. But insofar as slavery placed African Americans in a particular place in the social hierarchy, in the social order, et cetera, kind of oppression. The identification of slavery with race, with Africans, people of African descent, I mean, that is still very central to American history, to American life. And the slave narratives were crucial to the anti-slavery movement, first of all, and to changing Northern opinion about slavery. Understand that, once the slave narrative started to appear, Frederick Douglass's most famously, but not just Frederick Douglass's, people in the North didn't have much of a comprehension of what slavery was. There was a lot of mythology about the happy slaves and how great it all was for everybody, and it was a benevolent institution and all of that. And the slave narratives really punctured through that. The slave narratives really forced Northerners to come to terms with slavery in a way that they hadn't before. Not that all of them would, but many of them did. And it was not just the narratives, but having, the former slaves who escaped. What's the term for them now? Fugitive slaves used to be called. The slaves who had escaped from slavery, who had freed themselves. It wasn't just they wrote; they actually went out and lectured. They actually went around and gave important lectures. Frederick Douglass most famously of them. And Frederick Douglass would say, people want to know where I was schooled, and he would say, my diploma is on my back. It's a very powerful statement. And then, people knew what he was talking about, that he had been educated in the ways of cruelty that was the essence of slavery. So the narratives are very important. Now, the narratives are filtered. It's not just, unfiltered testimony, because it's filtered through the people who are helping to compile them and write them. And so it was written for a political purpose. They were propaganda, in effect. I mean, they're not quite literature. They're not quite propaganda. They're somewhere in between the two, but they were very, very important. I would say second only to something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a great deal of effect. But Uncle Tom's Cabin grew in part out of the slave narratives. So the two go together. At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, there were anti-slavery delegates there. There were pro-slavery delegates there as well, particularly from South Carolina and Georgia. And they wanted to make sure that slavery was given as much protection as possible under this new Constitution. They'd seen that the northern states had begun emancipation as early as 1780 in Pennsylvania, and they were worried about what was going on in the North. And they thought maybe now that we're forming this powerful new nation, maybe these guys are going to do something about slavery that we won't like. So they came to the convention really, loaded for all of that. The anti-slavery people were loaded too, as it were. Well, I don't want to put it that way. The anti-slavery people were prepared as well. And so there were these conflicts over slavery on various issues, which led to the compromises, the famous compromises in Philadelphia over the 3/5 clause. There wasn't so much a compromise, but certainly it gave the southern states, the slave-holding states, extra power in the House of Representatives and then in the Electoral College. The 20-year delay of abolishing the transatlantic slave trade, that was very important. Although, the fact that they managed to get anything in the Constitution that the federal government could abolish slavery, that was something the Southerners did not want to see happen. So they weren't happy about what happened with all of that. They went back and they had to explain it to everybody back home, and it was not that easy to explain. And then the Fugitive Slave Clause as well, it's actually the Fugitive Servant Clause, because it refers to servants rather than to slaves. But there were these compromises that were there, and without those compromises, it's unlikely that South Carolina or Georgia would have gone into the Union, and then it would have been no nation at all, as far as the people who were there at the convention were concerned. At the same time, though, there was a question as to what the position of slavery was going to be in national law. It's important to remember the Constitution it's a federal document. It's forming a nation out of states. There's going to be national law, the things that the nation can do, the national government can do, and they're going to be the things that the states can do. And a great deal is left to the states, including property laws and all things like that. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that the status of slavery in the states where it already existed was not going to be threatened by the national government. The question then, though, was what do we do about national law? What do we do about those areas where the federal government has purview, like over the national territories, for example, or in the new federal city they didn't know what it was going to be called, but they identified it. The high seas, there are a bunch of places where the federal government would have purview. Would slavery be tolerated there? Or would slavery be automatically tolerated there? And the delegates to the convention made it very clear that they were not going to let that happen. I mean, that they were not going to allow slavery to be part of national law, to be inscribed in national law. It leads to one of the things that really confused people about the Constitution. The Constitution, certainly slavery is certainly there, but the first time the word slavery appears in the Constitution is in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The word does not appear. And historians, we have arguments about why that was. But the record, I think, shows pretty clearly that it wasn't that they were embarrassed about slavery. They weren't trying to hide it. If they tried to hide it, they were doing a pretty bad job because people could figure it out pretty quickly. But they wanted to make sure that the idea of one person owning another, what they called property in man at that point, that would not be part of national law. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, they were a wily bunch. They did their best to get it in there. All kinds of places you can read the records that are left of the Federal Convention, and you can see them, sneaky doing this. Every time they try it, they get shot down. The convention majority will not allow that. Now, we can Historians argue all the time about why that was. How much did the framers really expect that slavery was on the way out? Certainly the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia did not think that slavery was on the way out. They thought that that was the center of their life and they were going to keep it going. But there were many who did. There are many who thought that, the slave economy, which was then based on tobacco, not on cotton, this is before the Cotton Revolution, that, slavery was going to eventually fade away, that the force of the American Revolution was so great. And the economy, the economics of the tobacco trade, which at that point, I like to say to my students, there were only so many pipes in Europe, right? That only so much tobacco was going to be purchased. There was a glut in the trade. So there was a feeling that, this is not going to last that much longer among some of the delegates. So we do argue about how much the framers actually thought, that generation actually thought slavery was on the way out. Some did, some didn't. But regardless of that, the majority of the convention wanted to make sure that slavery was not going to be made an intrinsic part of the new nation. That the new nation was not going to be a slaveholders' republic in the way that, for example, the Constitution of the Confederacy, the Constitution that the seceding South actually created in 1861. Oh yeah, all the parts in the federal Constitution where they kept slavery out, they put it in. They actually say, yeah, now we've got the Constitution that we ought to have really had in 1787. But that was at the end of a long fight about slavery, which was going to lead to the Civil War. So that was a very different kind of constitutional proposition. By 1850, certainly, slavery is intrinsic to American political life. The slaveholders had more or less dominated American political life for a very long time. The most important thing to understand is the Cotton Revolution, first of all. I mean, after 1787, in 1793, the invention of the cotton gin makes it possible to grow cotton at a scale and in places that simply wasn't going to be possible before that, feeding into making cotton the most valuable agricultural commodity in the world because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution's leading sector was the manufacture of cotton in Britain, but also in New England. And so cotton was really, today, it was a bit like, the petroleum, what petroleum became in the 20th century, cotton was in the 19th century. It was valuable agricultural, extractable commodity, right, or agricultural commodity. So that's number one, is to understand that slavery is going to have a rebirth. The institution of slavery undergoes a rebirth, which is crucial to understanding the politics of all of that. From the beginning, as I say, the South Carolinians and the Georgians, I always say it's nothing personal, but it's always South Carolina. It's always South Carolina that's at the forefront of pro-slavery militants. And they had been from the very beginning, which has to do with the politics of South Carolina. But at any rate, from the very beginning, they are fighting very hard. But the expansion of a cotton kingdom is going to mean that you're going to have in politics, as well as in the culture, as well as in the economy, you're going to have a force that's very, very pro-slavery, increasingly pro-slavery, that hadn't been there from the beginning. New slave states come in, Alabama, Mississippi. Later on, there's going to be a fight over Missouri. But this is going to change the political dynamics fundamentally. There are the ways that the parties get aligned very early on. The Jeffersonian Republicans, they were not all of the slaveholders by any means, but they were a slaveholding interest that was connected somewhat paradoxically to the more liberal interests of the North, to the small artisans and so forth. There was this very, very, to us now looking back, a kind of contradictory alliance that was part of American politics. And that was going to have a lot to do as well with keeping slavery there, making slavery even more central to American politics than the framers might have imagined that it would be. There is this interesting moment, this very interesting moment in 1819, 1820, because there had been an anti-slavery movement in the North, and it gets going, and it's there, and it's not as big as it's going to be, but it's pretty ferocious in certain places. In 1819, Missouri applies to become a new state. And the question is Missouri going to be allowed to come in with slavery or without slavery? Slavery already existed in Missouri at that point, so everybody assumed, it's going to be a slave state. Well, a New Yorker named James Talmadge gets up and says, no, we're going to amend the statehood bill, and slavery will not be allowed to survive in Missouri. We're going to get rid of slavery in Missouri. It causes this huge crisis. And for the better part of 2 years, actually, there's talk that there's going to be a civil war. Now, there are some people who say that if there was a civil war in 1819, it would have amounted to a fist fight on the floor of the House of Representatives. But that's a little misleading too, because there really was a very strong anti-slavery Free Missouri movement, it was called, that got going in 1819, 1820. Really scared people. John Quincy Adams, who at that point was the Secretary of State, writes in his diary, he's a very famous diary, he writes in his diary, he sees a terrible portent because the South can understand, the Southern slaveholders can understand, that there's a new party ready formed, as he put it, that is out to get rid of their institution, to get rid of slavery. In the aftermath of that crisis, the political center decides that they're going to clamp down on the whole question. They don't want to see the Missouri Compromise, the Missouri crisis. They don't want to see the Missouri crisis happen again. So they are determined to keep the issue of slavery out of national politics. And an entire political system grows up, dedicated to the proposition that slavery, either anti-slavery or pro-slavery, it's not going to become subject to debate the way that it had been at that moment in 1819, 1820. So going into the 1830s and really into the 1840s, you have a political system, political parties that are dedicated to keeping slavery out of debate. That's functionally about as pro-slavery as you can imagine, right? We're not going to talk about it. It exists. It's going to keep going. So you have this political system, which it looked like it might be able to open up for a minute, and then there was a shutdown. And that's where, the history of anti-slavery gets really interesting too, because that's where, you get the likes of David Walker up in Boston, a free black from from North Carolina. David Walker, a free black from North Carolina who had migrated up to Boston, writes a fiery pamphlet calling for, an appeal to the colored people of the world, calling upon them to renounce slavery, to rise up. And if white people did not want to give slaves their freedom, well, then they were going to take it anyway. That was pretty scary. But that was outside of politics. You see, David Walker was in part a reaction to the fact that politics had closed down. And then David Walker is followed by, the likes of William Lloyd Garrison and the rise of the immediatist abolitionists in the 1830s, much more radical than the previous anti-slavery movements had been. That's in part a matter of just disgust, but it's also a matter of the fact that there was no place for them to go. That politics was not going to work. The idea of moral suasion, that was the only way that you were possibly going to get it over with. The political system was so corrupt that getting involved in it was going to get you nowhere. So, by the 1830s, there's a feeling, in fact, that the political system is deeply pro-slavery. And then Abraham Lincoln is going to come out of all that. In the 1830s, two things conjoined, right? One was black abolitionists in the cities in particular, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. The outcome of Northern emancipation had in part been the growth of black communities in the bigger cities, right? They wanted to get away from where they'd been to come to the big cities. And there is a really very impressive collection of institutions, churches above all. The AME Church gets born in the 1790s, but it really grows in the cities thereafter. The Prince Hall Masonic Lodge, you name them. There are lots of different groups out there. The first black newspaper was founded in 1827, Freedom's Journal, in New York City by John Ross Merman and Samuel Cornish. There is a black abolitionist constituency that had not been there at the end of the 18th century that has grown. That's crucial to understanding the direction that anti-slavery politics is going to take. You then have also a religious revival among blacks and whites we refer to it as the Second Great Awakening, which evangelicized American Protestantism to no small degree. Now, that wasn't necessarily going to lead people automatically to be anti-slavery, but it led a lot of people in that direction because it emphasized questions of personal righteousness, of one's personal relationship to God. It changed the whole connection between man, women, and God in ways that required people to take account of their own, relationship to slavery among other institutions. And between the two of those things, I think, the Second Great Awakening and the growth of Black abolitionism, there is the beginnings of a truly radical abolitionist movement. We date it, I always date it from David Walker, but that's okay. Most people date it from 1831 when William Lloyd Garrison gets his newspaper, The Liberator, going, followed soon thereafter, a couple of years later, by the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is the first great mass anti-slavery organization in the United States. There have been others out there. They're mostly local. This was a bigger deal. This was going to transform the whole character of anti-slavery politics. It's going to make it much more broad-based. It's a mass movement. And they adopt all kinds of very, what should we say, imaginative ways to try to force the issue. They weren't going to be able to run people for office. They didn't think that was a good idea, but they were going to force the issue through direct action. How are they going to do that? Well, they did it through petitions in large measure. They got hundreds and thousands of people to sign petitions calling for the end of the domestic slave trade, calling for, above all, the abolition of slavery in the nation's capital, which was a very powerful idea at that point, because you see, as I said earlier, the federal government had control over D.C., had control over the government of the District of Columbia. So it was believed that Congress really could abolish slavery there. It couldn't do it anywhere else. It couldn't do it in any of the existing states, but it could do it there. So these petitions really roiled the Congress. And the Southerners Southern slaveholders were very upset about all of this. And there's a small group of Northerners, led by actually ex-President John Quincy Adams, who are standing up for these petitions and saying, you have to listen to these, you have to listen to these. And the Southerners say, we're not going to even going to honor them with the idea of listening to them. We're going to table them right away. We're going to stop. So they adopt something called the gag rule, which prevents these anti-slavery petitions from coming to the fore. It backfires, of course, on the Southerners, because the more that this happens, the more people begin to think, well, wait a minute, you guys are not allowing American democracy to happen. You're not allowing people to voice their will. There's one famous story out of all this, when John Quincy Adams gets up with a petition. And it's sort of he gets up for the House of Representatives and says, I here have a petition signed by X number of slaves. Well, the Southerners, you can imagine, they go absolutely nuts. I mean, it's one thing to have anti-slavery people petitioning the Congress, but to have enslaved people petitioning the Congress? So they go crazy, and they try to stop it, and they stop it, and they, point of order, blah, blah, blah. And then they want to stop John Quincy Adams. And then Quincy Adams reads the petition to say, yes, we slaves are very happy to be in slavery. Now, this was, the Southerners are going, oh, God. It was all a way to just embarrass them, which he was very effective at doing, he and his group inside of Congress. So you can see here, the politicians did not want to allow slavery to be involved in national debates, but the abolitionists force it. The abolitionists force it to happen. They're not going to run people for office, but they're forcing it. They're making it possible. And every time this happens, it's all over every newspaper. It's publicizing the cause. The other thing they do is they get anti-slavery pamphlets and they send them down to the South. They put them in the mails down to the South. In those days, now we get our mail sent to us, apart from email and all of that, but real snail mail. We got our mail delivered. Those of us who are old enough to remember stamps and stuff. In those days, you could address a bunch of, send a whole bunch of stuff to the local postmaster, and the local postmaster was duty-bound to actually keep those pamphlets in the post office where anybody could pick them up. So the American Anti-Slavery Society starts blanketing the South with and the postmaster is supposed to keep those things there. Well, they don't know this stuff. Who's going to pick it up? A free person of color could come by, pick it up, read it. Most likely that person knows someone who's enslaved. Maybe that gets out to them too. This is dangerous as far as the Southerners are concerned. for the American Anti-Slavery Society, it's a way to raise hell. You know, it's a way to it's direct action, as we call it in the 20th century, 21st century. They were the masters of all of that. So that was the politics that they practiced in the 1830s. And it did a lot to raise the consciousness of Northern whites about the status of slavery. It was going to remain a minority movement. It was going to remain outside of politics. But, you know, even then it was larger. It was, you know, 150,000 people signing those petitions. That was a sea change from what had been even in the 1820s when there was that movement that was going. It ran into difficulties. It did not free a single slave, if you will. I mean, it didn't change a law. It didn't get that done. It raised consciousness. But then by the time we get to the end of the 1830s, there's kind of a feeling of exhaustion, actually. I mean, they've been at it for 10 years. You know, moral suasion, the South wasn't going to get rid of slavery. All the moral suasion in the world was not going to get rid of slavery. What was going to happen? Where was change going to come? Black abolitionists were particularly, you know, they started holding, you know, they've been holding national conventions, but they're beginning to think, you know, maybe we have to go in a different direction. And a number of the white abolitionists in the American Anti-Slavery Society begin to think the same thing. So the movement hits a crossroads right at 1840, actually, at the end of that decade. The movement hits a crossroads about what direction it's going to take. In 1840, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the great abolition society, splits. It splits in part over the question of whether women should be involved in the leadership of the movement. A lot of people, Garrison included, wanted to turn the anti-slavery movement into a much broader reform movement to take on a whole bunch of causes, including the cause of women's rights. Whereas there were others who said, look, we have our hands full just dealing with slavery. We have to stick to that. And the movement splits. The movement also splits on the question of politics. You know, Garrison and others truly believed that the American Constitution and the American political system was intrinsically pro-slavery. Garrison's later going to burn the Constitution of the United States in Massachusetts in the Commons there, or not in Boston, but it's, I forget, Framingham, somewhere up there. He burns the Constitution in 1854 saying that, you know, it's a covenant with death and an agreement made in hell. That America itself is intrinsically pro-slavery. Not all the abolitionists agreed with him about that. There were abolitionists to look back on the Constitution, what we talked about earlier, the Constitutional Convention, who saw anti-slavery potential in the Constitution that Garrison and his supporters did not. And this actually ends up being the majority of the abolitionist movement, actually drift over to this point of view. And one thing that they do is to start a political party. They say, look, what's the center of this democratic, quote unquote, democratic political system we have? You know, since the 1820s, you know, white male suffrage had already spread, but you had the growth of political parties. You had involvement of ordinary white men on property as well as property that hadn't existed before. It was a big deal that it hadn't been, you know, quite before. If we're going to get anywhere in terms of slavery, we better be involved in politics. We can't stay outside of politics. And there's room for us in politics. We can defend our views. We can attack slavery and still defend the Constitution of the United States because there's an opening here for us. Well, they started that opening in 1840. They form a political party. They nominate James G. Birney, a former slaveholder from Kentucky. It ended up in Ohio. They don't actually call it the Liberty Party yet, but they're going to. A man named Gerrit Smith in New York, who's a great radical abolitionist, he's going to give it the name. But at any rate, they run, and they get 7,000 votes. Now, that's pretty small. There's not a mass outpouring of support for the Liberty Party in 1840, which, you know, if you were only interested in getting votes, would have been very discouraging. But the Liberty Party was after something more than that. They knew that this was the beginning, not the end. And they began attracting all sorts of new people into their ranks. A man named Salmon Chase from Ohio was a friend of Bernie's. He switches from the Whig Party over to the Liberty Party. That's going to be the germ of the anti-slavery politics that eventually is going to bring in Abraham Lincoln and lead to the Republican Party in the late 1850s. But it begins in 1840 with the formation of the Liberty Party. Much is going to happen in the 1840s, which is going to change the character of anti-slavery politics. It has to do, again, with westward expansion. It has to do with America's imperial ambitions. But it's going to bring the issue of slavery back in a way that that the mainstream had hoped to keep it out. This time, however, you do have an abolitionist movement. It's a mass movement. This time you do have a Liberty Party. This time you have people, even in the Democratic and Whig parties, are beginning to feel uncomfortable with the fact that slavery is no longer, is being kept out. They can't keep it out any longer. So by the time you get back to these questions in the 1840s, it's going to be very different political calculus. In the 1840s, there's a lot of pressure, as I said, because of America's imperial ambitions, et cetera. The annexation of Texas, and then the Mexican War, and the grabbing of half of Mexico. Well, that's not true. Am I right about that? It doubles the size of the United States at any rate. Means there's a lot more land, and all those issues about territories and slavery and what's going to become of these territories, they're opened up again. Now, of the two parties, the Whig Party is better disposed to anti-slavery than the Democratic Party was. The Democratic Party really was, many of the largest slaveholders were in fact Whigs, but the Democrats ended up becoming the party that was taken over really by the slaveholders, the pro-slavery interest in the South. The Whig Party had a Southern wing that was very powerful, many slaveholders there, but it could not sustain itself under the pressure of the politics of the 1840s. So by the time you get to 1854, a crucial date in understanding all of these politics, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party dissolved. The Whig Party falls apart. Southern Whigs are all for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Northern Whigs are all against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This party cannot exist any longer, which is going to leave a lot of people without a political home, including a Whig ex-congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who doesn't have a home anymore. He doesn't know where he is in politics. And at the same time, he understands that, look, slavery is now inevitably at the center of our politics. There's no keeping it out anymore. And we can't think about politics without thinking about the question of Kansas, Nebraska, and thinking about the question of slavery. So politics changed profoundly. Before 1854, Abraham Lincoln was a stalwart Whig. He said he was a Henry Clay Whig. He was a great admirer of the Kentucky Senator Henry Clay. He believed in the program of the Whig Party, which at that point was in favor of things like internal improvements, building canals, railroads, using federal support to do all of that, a high tariff. He saw the Whigs, as opposed to the Democrats, as being the party of progress, the party of uplift, the party of improvement. And he was a very dedicated Whig, and stayed that way right up to, as he himself said, until there was nothing. He was in the Whig Party until there was no Whig Party left for him to be in anymore. So he believed in the Whig cause. Now, understanding that this all goes back to the Missouri Compromise again. The idea was that the Missouri Compromise had supposedly settled the question of slavery and expansion. They let Missouri in, but it meant as a slave state. They let Missouri in as a slave state, but it meant that everything above everything above 30 degrees, 30 minutes was going. Everything above 36 degrees, 30 minutes was going to be free soil. The Kansas-Nebraska law, Kansas-Nebraska Act, undid that. It undid that. When you undid that, then the whole thing's going to fall apart politically. It means now that all bets are off. It means now that the slave power, as they called it, is on the offensive. It means now that the last protections we had about possibly stopping slavery's expansion, that has been undone. This agreement that was made in 1820. So that people like Lincoln, who were anti-slavery, his anti-slavery politics was pretty clear at that point, but it was a recessive. It was it was not at the front of his politics. It was more at the middle of the back of his politics. Now it is at the very front. With Kansas, Nebraska, there is no way that politics is going to be able to go back to the way it was under the Whigs and Democrats. So it wasn't just the Whig Party fell apart, but the entire political system was transformed. And slavery then is the major issue, as it will remain, right through to the end of slavery in 1865. Enduring issue. Well, we ended slavery, but the effects of slavery certainly are, sure. I mean, it's not the only enduring issue, but it's one of them. Look, at the heart of American history, I believe, is, the same contradiction that arose in 1787. It's the contradiction between a democratic republic and the institution of slavery. And, the founding generation thought that you could, establish one with the other at the same time. And it took a horrific civil war to undo that idea. But the institution was strong enough. And then the aftermath of the Civil War wasn't just the slavery.
Politically, it was the Democrats. It ended up changing over. But the Democrats, they were the pro-slavery people back then. They was the Democrats. They were used to be it's difficult. They change all the time. And back then, so you had another political party that arrived, which they called themselves the Republicans. They were anti-slavery. And then you had the other party, which was called the Whig Party, and they come out with their political name, Democrats. So you'll see what happened. So, yeah.
To have abolished slavery, which was an extraordinary thing when you think about it. I mean, until the Revolutionary era, there was no anti-slavery among white people. There was none. I mean, the Quakers, some at the end of the 17th century, but slavery had been an institution that went back millennia. It goes back to classical times. Slavery in the New World was there from the beginning in the 15th century. I mean, it was there. And then African slavery comes in very quickly. This was accepted. No one said anything. I mean, the enslaved had plenty to say about it. But their revolts were crushed. They could not prevent the expansion of this vast plantation complex throughout the New World, slave-based plantation complex. So when you step back then, when you take the long view, the abolition of slavery is an extraordinary thing. It's not just an American story. It's a story that in Britain and in France and other places, all of the European monarchies that established slavery in the New World, right, all had to deal with it in one way or another. But when you think that for all the millennia that slavery had existed, and then to think within the space of 70, 80 years, in the case of the British, less than that, the institution is abolished in the West. Not in the West. It's abolished in the United States. It's still going to continue in Cuba and Brazil. But nevertheless, it's on the defensive. I mean, this is an extraordinary turnabout to me historically. And it astonishes me, actually, to think of how the combination of slaves, the enslaved people, free blacks, white abolitionists, white politicians, how that converged to end this institution that had been so powerful for so long and so unquestioned for so long, so rationalized for so long as the work of God, let alone the work of man. That slavery was biblical. I mean,
I think he's gonna get into that. I think they call themselves the liberation. It is difficult because this is a time around a slavery time, and this you have your anti-slavery, and they was trying to form a political party after they failed at actually getting these things in Congress, because Congress did not want to even put it on the table, and they put a gag order. Let me stop him before he gets too far. So They put a gag order so because they did not want to discuss it in Congress. They wanted to keep it more of like a state to state issue. And so, things do what they do. Then we had the Civil War and everything. But let's see, I think there were no liberals. Okay, the anti-slavery group were, you can say they was liberals. We just, after time going on, we come up with different kind of names. So, you know, liberals, they were more than just anti-slavery. Like today is for women's rights, and it was a whole lot of other things that happened, during these times. Hold on, baby. Let me see it a bit later. So it means Dems were right wing and Republicans were lefties, and now it's a vice versa. It is crazy. Yes, it is. Yes, that's yes, baby. That's exactly what happened back then. It changed over, and yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Think about where the United States was, say, in 1880. When I think of where slavery was in 1903, when Dr. Du Bois, published The Souls of Black Folk. Imagine what America was in 1900. To see us a century later where we are, again, I take the long view. That's a fairly brief period of time. Of course, I'm getting older now, so that it all seems to be a briefer period of time. But nevertheless, there's for all of the torture and the heartbreak and the sorrow and the for all the grotesquerie of history in that period, the arc of the moral universe has been going more or less in the right direction, it seems to me. But it has only done it through struggle. And believe me, there have been setbacks. Revolutions do not sometimes, revolutions can go backwards. And, we've seen that happen plenty of times, most poignantly at the end of the Civil War. Joshua Giddings from Ohio was a fascinating character in all of the story. He was a congressman from Ohio. He was an evangelical Christian, very religious man, going back to the Second Great Awakening, and was deeply anti-slavery. In the early 1840s, he gets in trouble with his own party, with the Whig Party. He's there in Ohio. He's there in the House, and there had been a revolt on a ship called the Creole. And there was led by a cook named Madison Washington. Can you imagine? An enslaved man named Madison Washington. Now that's only in America, right? He comes up in the House with a proposal defending basically the Creole Rebellion. Well, you can imagine what the response to that was. Not just from Southerners, but from his own Ohio Whig Party. They basically cast him out. He is thrown out of the House of Representatives. And he goes back to Ashtabula. I think that's where he's from, Ashtabula. And he gets reelected. His people are as anti-slavery as he is, and they send him right back. So Giddings is kind of a hero among the anti-slavery Whigs in the early 1840s, precisely with the Creole incident. He's doing a lot more than that, but that's emblematic. In 1846, another Whig from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, gets elected. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln gets elected to the Congress from Illinois. And he goes to Illinois, he goes to Washington. He's trying to figure out where's he going to live, because in those days, congressmen lived in boarding houses. They didn't live in fancy digs, they lived in boarding houses. He actually had Mary Todd Lincoln with him at that point. I think she just decided to just get out of there. She didn't want to hang around Washington too much longer. But he gravitates to a boarding house owned by a woman named Anna Spriggs. And it's right near where the Supreme Court is now, right behind the Capitol, right? They can walk to work. Huh? Well, Anna Spriggs' boarding house is also known as Abolition House. It's where Joshua Giddings was located, among others. And while everybody in there was not Joshua Giddings, and there were some Southerners in there as well, or some border state people at any rate in there as well. But it had a reputation of being, pretty solid anti-slavery place. Theodore Dwight Well, the great abolitionist, had hung out at an abolition house. It was pretty notorious. That's where Abraham Lincoln decides he's going to mess. That's where he's going to board. These are going to be his messmates. So from very early on, and Lincoln befriends Giddings, and he gets it. He's not Joshua Giddings at this point. He's not a big abolitionist. He's not going to be. He's from Central Illinois. He's not going to kill off his own. His people would not have reelected him as Giddings's people reelected him in 1844. But he's sympathetic. And while he's in Congress, actually, the gravitating to Abolition House was one sign of all of this. I mean, he certainly opposes the Mexican War. He stands up and takes the anti-slavery Whig position, Northern Whig position on the war, which is that this is an unjust war that had been started by the President of the United States, James K. Polk. He demanded to know the exact spot where American soldiers had been fired upon that was supposedly the cause of the war. He got the nickname Spotty Lincoln on that account, which, not the nicest nickname to have, but it was done in the cause of opposing the Mexican War, alongside another congressman, the man I was mentioning earlier, John Quincy Adams, who would also oppose the war ferociously. Lincoln supports a provision called the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, 47, 48, which was going to make sure that any lands obtained in the Mexican War were going to be free of slavery. It was a kind of Northwest ordinance, going back to the 1780s, a Northwest ordinance for these new lands. Strong anti-slavery, really a flashpoint in anti-slavery politics. Again, showing that you could not keep slavery out anymore. It was there on the floor of the House. Lincoln says he must have voted for the Wilmot Proviso, I don't know, a dozen times or something. That was an exaggeration. It only got voted on 5 or 6 times. But nevertheless, he voted for it. Then he proposes something which I think historians have not given him quite the credit he's due, which is that he proposes a gradual emancipation plan for Washington, D.C. Now, it doesn't get very far. It doesn't pass. However, this had been one of the great abolitionist causes in the 1830s. This was a radical idea only 10 years earlier. This was something that the Congress was passing gag rules to keep petitions about this out of the debate. Actually, it goes back even further than that. There was, as early as 1805, there was a wonderful guy who was anti-slavery guy who was proposing to get rid of slavery in the District of Columbia. Well, Lincoln picks up on that. That's an interesting convergence, because here's this Illinois Whig who is anti-slavery, but not that anti-slavery, but he's going to be putting forward what had been an emblematic abolitionist demand. He's putting it forward in the House when he does. These are all signs that, Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Walt Whitman that his great career, which began with Leaves of Grass, must have had a long foreground someplace. This is Abraham Lincoln's long foreground in terms of anti-slavery politics. You can take it all the way back to the 1830s, actually, in Illinois. But, it's not the forefront of his politics, but it's there in his politics. So that you can understand why in 1854, coming after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, but in 1854 with Kansas, Nebraska, there's no question what side Abraham Lincoln's going to be on. Well, by 1860, the Republican Party has emerged as a power. It was the second party. It was unclear after the Whigs fell apart.
I'm going to pause this because I don't want to get too far. Want him to continue and get too far ahead, because I think this is very important. DG, look, this is political theater. These different politicians, the opposite of democracy, they have nothing to offer the people. So they offer them hate and anger and whatisms. They don't care about the people, really. It's all about themselves. To enrich themselves, they beg for money all the time. They try to play victims, but they're really not interested. And so it's always been like that. But these people and the people that followed them always was there. But they was up under the rocks because certain things, certain issues, just like black folks just being black and existing, when Donald Trump comes, the orange pig, he opened up a can of worms. So they started coming out everywhere because they thought that they were able to do whatever they want. And so on and so forth. It's always been like that. And it kind of been like that. So but things are terrible right now because he's being accountable. So they will spew all this misinformation, these lies, and things like that. And while that is happening, because they do it to distract us from what they're really doing, these governors, they're banning books, banning black history, they're banning, whew, is crazy. And then you want to know what the excuse is? We don't want the little white girls and boys to feel guilty. Like, how in the world do you think banning books is going to stop that if these babies, the little white girls and boys, live in the streets? They're going to ask some questions. You cannot stop history. You can ban all the books you want, but you going to have somebody's old grandma, somebody's old great grandma tell you that history and stuff. You got grandmas that's still living today that was a part of slavery. And no, it didn't benefit us. It didn't benefit my ancestors to be a slave like the stupid Ron DeSantis was trying to put out there. That fucking idiot. Oh, he's so disgusting. How would that benefit us? Everything that we knew we brought there when you brought my ancestors over there. We already knew that. We was building our own shit. You didn't teach us shit. Fucking idiots. Okay, I'm gonna continue on because I'm getting very excited. I hope I can answer your question.
It was unclear who was going to succeed the Whig Party. And for a while, it looked as if it might be the nativists. There was a nativist movement that had gotten going in the 1850s. Actually, it was earlier, but it really gets going in the 1850s. And they established something that was known as the Know Nothing Party. And they nominated, in 1856, they nominate former President Millard Fillmore for the presidency. So there were a lot of people who thought, well, the Whigs are gone, now the Native Americans, the nativists are going to take over. They were called the Native Americans, not to be confused with the Native Americans that we referred to, but that's what they called themselves. But then there were the anti-slavery people as well, the so-called anti-Nebraska, faction that was many Whigs, some Democrats, and the old Liberty Party and Free Soil Party. So there was a contention as to what was going to supplant the Whig Party. In the end, it was the Republicans. The Know Nothings are not going to be able to become a sectional force, let alone a national force. The Republicans, however, do become the successor to the Whig Party, and they are a sectional force. Abraham Lincoln does not appear on the ballot in large parts of the South. He's just not there. The Republican Party does not exist. But it was an extraordinary coalition. Lincoln himself, as late as 1855, is still wondering where he's going to go. There's no Whig Party left. Where is he going to go? He's not quite sure. He ends up going in with the Republicans. Now, in 1858, Lincoln had made quite a name for himself and made quite a name for the Republican Party in his race against Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senator from Illinois. Lincoln and Douglas had been, each other's nemesis for a very long time. They knew of each other very, very well by this point. They were both very ambitious men. Stephen A. Douglas was the absolute incarnation of the pro-slavery or the pro-Southern Democrats. He was a racist of the highest order. When you read his speeches now, and every time you see the word Negro, that's not the word he said in that
It
speech.
says nigger.
He was unabashed in his racism, and he believed that he did not believe that slavery was a terribly important moral issue. So he ran for the Senate on the platform the idea of popular sovereignty. That is to say that the people who were out in the territories ought to be able to decide for themselves whether slavery would be there or not. Lincoln took the other view, which was precisely that the United States government, the Congress in particular, had the power to keep slavery out of the territories and ought to do so, and had a duty to do so. So in 1858, and that's the position of the Republican Party in 1856, and they ran very well in 1856, but Lincoln helps to bring those politics to the forefront with those great debates against Douglas in 1858. He loses the election, in part because the legislature was basically, there was a gerrymandering, basically. The old legislature.
Let me stop it there. So, DJ, if you're still here, this is how parties change, okay? So, the anti-slavery, they were the Republican Party at the time. What the Democrats are now, the kind of party the Democrats are, they used to be the Republicans, but they changed over time.
If districts kicked in, he got the most votes, but he didn't win the election. Sound familiar? But he made a great impression. Here was this Western Republican who was, standing up to maybe the leading Democrat outside of the president, Stephen A. Douglas, and giving him a run for his money, and making the Republican argument as eloquently and as powerfully as anybody had to this point. So the Republican Party has come a very long way in a very short time. It had sort of been born in 1854 in the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By 1856, it does run a presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. But by 1860, it is contending for national power in no uncertain terms. It is thought that whoever the Republican nominee would be in 1860 would stand a very, very good chance of winning the election. The guy named John Brown kind of messes that up for the Republicans at the last minute because, it looks like, maybe the Republicans aren't going to be so popular. But they managed to do so. But it was very much Lincoln's doing, I think. Again, Lincoln, had Lincoln not gotten the nomination in 1860, I'm not altogether sure that the Republicans would have won that election. William Seward, the leading contender besides Lincoln for the nomination, the person that everybody thought was going to get the nomination was William H. Seward from New York, who had a long-standing anti-slavery career, a very distinguished one. And he had given a very powerful speech, actually, saying that there was a higher law than the Constitution. He was sort of misconstrued in all of that. But he was thought of as a real radical on the anti-slavery question, much more radical than Lincoln was thought to be. And this is just a guess. I'm a historian. I'm not a prognosticator. But my guess is that if Seward had won the nomination, he might have had a very difficult time carrying what we think it was the lower North. That is to say, Pennsylvania, even parts of New York, Illinois, Indiana. I'm not so sure that they would have gone for Seward. And it took Lincoln to keep them in the Republican Party. And, if Stephen A. Douglas had somehow won those votes and had somehow managed to eke out a victory, well, then all of American history would have looked very, very different. So I think that Lincoln's nomination was really very, very important. I'm not saying, I don't want to go on record saying that it would have happened. I don't know. It's a who knows. But let's put it this way: that Lincoln's winning the nomination, and there's still going to be, it's going to be hard for the Republicans to win that lower North. Nevertheless, it was much more possible for them to do so with Lincoln as the nominee than Seward as the nominee. I'd put it that way. So that while there was no guarantee either way, Lincoln's nomination was really important. Abraham Lincoln, look, he's 6'4". He looks kind of gawky. There are those who say he comes right out of P.T. Barnum. He's kind of freaky looking, and he himself says this all the time.
He is talking about Abraham Lincoln. And this is something that I must miss when I was doing history in school. I did not know he was from Illinois. I am from Illinois, y'all. So this is really very much informative for me.
People have accused him of being two-faced. He says, if you had a face like mine, he would make fun of his own looks. Lincoln, when he spoke, either in the debates or even when he was giving a speech, people describe him as he would begin the speech looking kind of awkward and not necessarily all that comfortable, and didn't look great in his clothes necessarily, and he didn't speak. He had a very high-pitched voice. It wasn't a stentorian voice like this. It was not a politician's voice. It was kind of high-pitched and squeaky like this. But he did have an ability, which was he could throw his voice very far. He was able to reach the back of a crowd. Remember, there's no microphones. This is 1858. What you've got is what you've got. And he had an ability to project his voice to the very back of a crowd, about as well as anybody. He learned this as a lawyer in part. He had that ability, so that even in his squeakiness, he could still be heard and understood. But people describe him as starting off kind of disheveled, and then suddenly he would warm to his subject, and a kind of glow would come upon him. And he would be able to, pull people in. This ugly rube from Illinois suddenly became charismatic, people said. You were drawn to him by the way that he spoke, by the calmness, by the clarity of his logic. This was the late Lincoln. Early Lincoln was something of a slasher. He could really take you apart if he wanted to. And there's some of that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But Douglas, on the other hand, is like a bulldog. I mean, Douglas is short. He's called the Little Giant. He barks as much as he speaks. He uses racist terms all the time. He's vindictive. He's nasty in a way that Lincoln is not. Lincoln can be witty and cutting, but he's not going to, be attacking Stephen A. Douglas in the way that Douglas is attacking him. Very different style. Very different style. Which, Douglas's supporters loved it. They thought of him as a, real man. He's a tough guy. But Lincoln had a way of dominating the debates, especially once you got out of the deep south part of the state, out of what was called Egypt, down, in the southern part of the state, which is mostly settled by refugees from the south. And once you got up, further north, he had the ability to turn Douglas's logic inside out. Well, Douglas had a problem in 1858. And it was it seems very abstruse now, but it was basically that he supported the Dred Scott decision, even though the Dred Scott decision basically had nullified popular sovereignty. His view was popular sovereignty. You could not own them both. But he tried. He tried to square the circle. And Lincoln was absolutely devastating because he had this clear, logical, Euclidean mind, but he had the ability to express that Euclidean mind in ways that really, undercut or cut Douglas to the quick. Not to say that Douglas was ever undone by all of this. He had his tricks, but Lincoln certainly stood up to him. And don't forget, Stephen A. Douglas had been in the Senate for a long time. Lincoln was this ex-congressman, one-termer. I mean, he was a nobody, quote unquote. And the fact that he was able to take on, one of the great men of the Democratic Party, perhaps the greatest man of the Northern Democratic Party, and fight him to that kind of standstill, well, it not only made his name, but it made Republican politics more powerful, more popular than they ever had been before. Lincoln was not glib. You know what I'm saying? He was not a guy. He wouldn't necessarily have been really great on TV necessarily, for example. He was a very thoughtful person. He prepared for his speeches. He prepared. He studied. he did a dissertation's amount of work behind some of his speeches. The Cooper Institute speech in 1860, which is one of his most important. He really worked on that for a very long time beforehand. So when you say his speeches reflect that kind of careful thoughtfulness that he brought to everything, but he certainly brought it to his politics, and he certainly brought it to he brought it to his presidency, but he brought it to his politics. So yeah, I think that the again, the logic, the clarity, but also the information that he had to hand. This was Lincoln, the lawyer in terms of preparation, but also in some ways, I wouldn't call him a scholar exactly, but he was, extremely well prepared, and you see that in the speeches as well. It's the combination of careful preparation and lucidity. When you read a Lincoln speech, you're not left mystified as to what the man just said. You know exactly what he just said, and that's an art. That's not that easy. Now, you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is a different kind of thing, and he'll have prepared remarks, but then it'll be about the cut and thrust of politics, and he's very good at that too. Lincoln's a politician, and you have to understand him as a politician at every moment along the way, and that means being able to react as well as being able to attack, and he could do that very well. But what I think makes him where I think Lincoln really stands apart is the care with which he went about his thinking. He would not come to a quick decision about something. He thought long and hard. He wasn't. I want to make it sound like he's a doofus. I mean, he's not. He's not slow in the way. There's a deliberation. He's got a deliberate mind as well as an elegant mind. He's got a.
I think what he's trying to say is Lincoln thought before he opened his fucking mouth, and he thought about what his position was and what he wanted to speak about. I think that he thought about his ideology and did careful thought about it before he put it out there.
He's got a deliberate mind as well as an elegant mind. William Herndon, his law partner, once said that Abraham Lincoln was a little engine of ambition that knew no rest. Yes, that's true. But he was, in terms of his public statements, he was always political. And this leads a lot of people to misunderstand what Lincoln is talking about. I think John Hay actually said at some point that unless you understand the context of what Lincoln is saying, unless you understand what is going on around what he is saying, you can never really understand Abraham Lincoln. So if you take him out of context, as lots of historians are wont to do, you will misunderstand what he's talking about. Abraham Lincoln has outwitted just about as many American historians as he has, politicians of his own day, precisely because people don't necessarily understand him as a politician, as a political leader. For example, the most famous example is the 1862 response to Horace Greeley, where Greeley they're very impatient with Lincoln for not having come up with an Emancipation Proclamation or not doing enough to turn the war into a war against slavery. It's still a war for the Union, and it's not turned yet into a war against slavery. So Greeley publishes this editorial in the Tribune, in the Daily Tribune, the Prayer of the 20 Million, I think it's called, and attacking Lincoln, criticizing Lincoln for not having moved faster. And Lincoln responds with a very careful response, which makes him sound very conservative. He says, "Look, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I could do it. But I'm here to save the Union." So everybody thinks, wow, really a conservative. Well, what people didn't know was that he was already drafting the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. that he was in a political situation where he knew he was going to have to prepare more conservative Northerners for the fact that he was about to deliver this thing, that the political context he was in, he wasn't being conservative, he was being political. Now, you can say there are those of us who think that being political is a terribly immoral thing. Well, that may be true unless you're a politician and unless you're a president. And if you're a president, you have no choice but to do that if you want to get done, if you want to get anything done. So this is one example of all of that. There are many examples of all of that.
I want to explain that. I think I can explain that. Politicians are politicians. People are people. When you have the politicians, and you have a decent politician, because most of them have some narcissistic tones to them, but in order to get some things done, they may have to go and negotiate with the other side. The other side, like we have today, are radical as hell, but sometimes when people that's on the ground, citizens, they say, oh, the president is not doing this, the president is not doing that. What you have to realize is that the presidents do not have all of the say. A lot of presidents have to do executive orders, which they will be criticized for because they did not negotiate with the Congress. And today we have a house of fucking idiots that is all about hate. They're not trying to negotiate nothing. They just want what they want. It's political theater. They will crash this America because of their own needs. You know, like, because most of them have social media accounts. Maybe they want views, maybe, and they just don't really give a shit. It's always a get back, because things are not how they want them to be. So this is in any case, any president, and we're talking about the 1800s, and it was exactly the same thing then. Because people, one side want this, the other side says no, that is immoral, that is terrible. And the other side, because there's some dogs, because they want things how they want them to be, because that's what they used to, because they want to keep the power, they want to get the money. They are sick individuals, and they say, okay, we're gonna block this, block that. We got a senator, Tuberville, who is totally brought socialism into our military. And you know why he's holding back? Because the military they give women in the military rights and give them money and time off just in case they want abortions. Now, they're not giving them abortions. They're just saying, hey, you get travel money, wherever you want to go, do whatever you want to do. This fucking idiot, one fucker, that stupid bastard. And then we got all these confirmations that's supposed to happen to, so that our military can operate like it's supposed to. You got this one idiot. Because, motherfucker, the military is apolitical, meaning they're not political. You don't pull your social bullshit with the military. They have to protect us, protect this country. I swear, they're all gonna shit. It is really ridiculous, the political theater. It's really ridiculous how they just don't even give a shit. They don't give a shit either. And he's standing on his shit like, what the hell? But these are the dumbest fucks in Congress. And believe this, all the dumb ass motherfuckers in Congress. I do not fucking believe it. And they only there because, man, they raised enough money to run, you know, influences. They know people. But these motherfuckers are silly fucking willies, and they some angry, hateful, don't give a fuck about you on the ground, but they beg you for fucking money. For anything. They get indicted. Oh, they doing a fundraiser. Oh, and they try. These motherfuckers know that they're guilty. And then you got people, I'm sorry. You got fucking people that they don't give a shit about. They did shit for them, and they'll just give them their last money. It is unreal, like how hateful people are. And the only reason that shit happens is because people some people got a stick stuck up their ass, and they just can't get over that this world is diverse now. Suck it, stupids. Suck it.
A CRM shouldn't weigh your budget down.
Not exactly what people imagine it was at the time, and not exactly what historians have imagined that it was since. And you know, again, historians write about politics a lot, but they don't necessarily understand politics. You know, and it took me a long time to figure this out myself, but being a little bit more around politics. You know, politics is sometimes called the art of the possible. Well, I guess that's true. But there's an art to that art that I think a lot of historians don't understand. It's much more artistic. It's much more creative.
I'm gonna start this again to answer the question from DG. You know what, DG? I don't understand it either. I think, how you like for the Merlin? I think what it is with these people, they're so consumed with power, entitlement, and monies, and so they know the history. But they want to still control. And I'm a black woman, and I'm like, oh my God, my ancestors went through hell. But they don't have no morals. They don't care. How can you make a person that's a God person? God made all of us and make a body a slave. I think that's cool. And then you have the entitlement that it is unbelievable. I do not have the answer to your question, but other communities, you say they don't do that to other communities. Yes, they do. Like, oh my God, they created so many lies about the Holocaust. There's certain communities that they absolutely do it to, but being a black person or black people, slavery is very prevalent in this history, in American history. The Holocaust is very prevalent in American history. But they were so brutal with slaves, they try to hide it. And so they just don't want to talk about it. They're banning damn books. Anything to do and not just black history. We got superstars, Hispanics, athletes, all these things. Hi Marlene, hi baby. And this is what it is. And I do not understand, but it is what it is. I did not know anything about racism until I got grown. until it actually happened to me. My parents never said nothing about racism or anything, and maybe because I lived in the north, I don't know, but I'm sure it was prevalent then. And until one time, I did go down south, and I was like, "What? Don't look. You have to look down at the ground." I was like, "Why?" I didn't understand it because I wasn't taught it. So once I got older and I'm like, damn, this is what's going on, I started to pay more and more attention. And these are the times that we live in. Sorry, sorry, sorry. They would not give up. I don't even understand what they're trying to hold on to. We're done with slavery. But history is there. And we, our children, need to know about it. All children. Black, brown, green, Asian, Holocaust children. We all need to know about our history because it's American history. But they want to keep that word. I don't have, I don't have a clue. But I don't think it will be such success. But anyways, let's continue. Oh my God, I get passionate about these things. I'm sorry. Because it's so ridiculous. And then you part this with the idiots in Congress, the MAGA Republicans. I swear all of them stupid as hell. Like, I don't get it. Like, too bad I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Maybe I can just get in Congress.
It's much more powerful, and it's an art that many of us just don't get. Um, um, so Lincoln exemplifies that. Another, FDR was the same. In many ways, I think of the two of them as of American presidents. Well, and Jefferson could be that way too, actually. Often speaking by indirection, saying what you thought you wanted. He telling you what you thought he heard turns out to be nothing really about what he was saying, or was strategic rather than didactic. Lincoln comes out of a part of Kentucky where the Baptist church was actually very strong, and it was an anti-slavery Baptist church. People forget there was probably more anti-slavery, organized anti-slavery in the border states at the time that Lincoln was a young man, 1810, 1820, than there was in the North. And the Methodists, the Baptists in particular, had a very strong anti-slavery animus. That was all going to go. That was all going to disappear by the time we got to the 1840s and 50s. But early on in the 19th century, it was pretty strong. Indeed, many of the migrants who start off in the border states like Kentucky, who end up in Illinois, Indiana, Illinois, were, I don't want to say poor, but they were, not rich, middle class, that's not the right word. They were farmers who wanted to get away from slavery as much as anything else. Now, they just thought that it was, a disgusting institution, and they didn't want to be living amidst it. They also didn't like the fact that there were slaveholders who were running the show. They just wanted to get away from all of that. And Lincoln's family was like that. So they end up in Indiana and then in Illinois. Does it take? I mean, Abraham Lincoln's not a Baptist. Abraham Lincoln is something of a free thinker, actually. This is part of his growth, his evolution. As a young man, he's reading Thomas Paine and people like that, and he never becomes a conventional Christian, actually, despite the fact that many have tried to make him into such a thing. Despite the fact that he mobilizes religious speech, and particularly the King James Bible, as effectively as anybody in American history has. Despite all that, he went to church and so on, but he was never a particularly believing Christian. So he didn't buy the Baptist part of all of that. But I think that when he said that he was naturally anti-slavery, I think that that's part of it. And it goes all the way back to his youth in Kentucky amidst the anti-slavery Baptists. There are many stories of Lincoln, seeing coffles of slaves and his trips down the Mississippi as a riverboatman and so forth. And, they're true. But I don't think there was a moment where the scales suddenly fell from Abraham Lincoln's eyes, where he was one thing and then all of a sudden you discovered that slavery was a terrible thing. And that's what I think he meant by all of that. That I don't think he ever had an idea that slavery was an institution or a human relation or a form of oppression that he could, abide, let alone something that he could support. So that's what I think happened. He didn't go through a pro-slavery or indifference to slavery and then suddenly become anti-slavery. I think it was there from the beginning. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is born in dirt. Abraham Lincoln comes up from, about as, it's not, let me back up. I didn't mean that. Because it wasn't dirt. But Abraham Lincoln came from, shall we say, a hard scrabble background. He was by no means out. He was not born.
Just
right?
say
He was
from the ground.
If there was a self-made man in an age of self-made men, Abraham Lincoln was one of them. So it took tremendous ambition for him to get even to the point where he was a successful lawyer in Springfield, Illinois. So this was, I want to say it's all-consuming, but I think that he knew that he was cut above others, that he could make it in the world by dint of his brains. He could also make it on the basis of his brawn too. And he was no mean fighter. He could toss people pretty far. That was one of the reasons that he turned that to good political use. Actually, his ability to fight, literally to wrestle. This showed in a time where white guys are the soul of American democracy, and tough white guys are maybe even more. Well, he's a tough white guy. He can do that. He can play that game. But he's also this other figure, and so his ambition is extraordinary. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, said at some point, I believe, that she was going to marry the next president of the United States, or man who would become president of the United States. Stephen Douglas actually courted her, so she made the right choice. She knew an ambitious suit her when she saw one, and Abraham Lincoln was certainly, ambitious. But the question of courage and ambition, I'm not sure that in American politics, one can be effectively courageous without ambition. I don't think that you can unleash that. I mean, I can be courageous. But unless I want to go somewhere, I'm being courageous that nobody really does. It's to no effect. So you have to combine that. You're surely not going to get to the high office, the highest offices in the land, without ambition. It's almost a it's a given, I think. Now, ambition can sometimes occlude principle, can sometimes, wipe principle out. If you're only ambitious, usually end up as a person successful in your own time, who leaves very little of a mark on history. There's a million of them. The thing about Lincoln was, he was, and I've written this, but I mean, he was an egalitarian politician. Now, that seems, in many people's eyes, that's an oxymoron. That's a contradiction, right? How can you be an egalitarian and be a politician at the same time? Well, you can, and Lincoln was that, which is to say that he understood, he had very deep principles, which only deepened as he grew older. But he understood that they were going to get nowhere unless you were a politician as well, unless you were going to actually be able to wield power. And you're only going to get to wield power if you were political. And he's the embodiment, actually, of that kind of egalitarian, that kind of egalitarian political combination. There are others. Just recently, my good friend, John Lewis was like this. I mean, he had that combination of understanding how politics worked. He really, really did. It came through tragedy. It came hard. It was not necessarily something he was born to in Alabama, but he came to understand it.
Let me stop that just in case y'all don't know who he's talking about. John Lewis, the black man. John Lewis, that was in Congress for many, many years. He recently passed away, but he walked, marched. This is something. I don't know why he's bringing him up now because he's supposed to be talking about in the 19th century or whatever. But, Joe, do you think Lincoln didn't care about slavery to begin with? He just wanted to be the president, and he brought new things to influence for his own benefit. DG, baby, I don't know where. I think, and the man just discussed it, that he was very ambitious, but he was political as well. I just explained that Lincoln always, probably more than likely, was anti-slavery. He didn't just start to be anti-slavery. Uh, Conrad explained that. He didn't just start being anti-slavery. Some people, whether they white, black, green, blue, purple, whatever, red, they sometimes have morals, whatever color you are. And maybe it bothered him that he's watching these brilliant black people being used as tools to build America, to build whatever, to pick cotton, and being brutally mistreated. And maybe that got to the core of his soul. And as the man said, it wasn't like he was all this religious dude, but morals could be just as beautiful as religion. Because some religion, some of these people that they call themselves religious, oh my God, they're the worst, terrible people ever. Like, for real. Morals is a sense of yourself. Morals is like, for me, morals is like, I wouldn't do to a person that I wouldn't want done to me. So for me, morals is you. To me, it is you being the best person that you can be. Religion is just a thing that people do. I have a God of my own understanding. I don't even go to church. I go to church sometimes when I want to hear a choir sing. But if you have one, two people together and you are praising your God, whichever God, because everybody don't have to worship the same God. It's a God of your own understanding, a God that takes care of you. Whatever faith you're in, you're only speaking to the one person that we're used to. A lot of people idolize like the orange pig. They think that. These are conspiracy theories that get out there. And no, man. I mean, like, what would be the use of having faith in something you can't touch, feel, or nothing when you got these idiots idolizing a man? You can touch and feel him if he will let you. So faith is what is your own. It's your own person. That is yours. No one can take your faith from you. And if you're a conspiracy theorist and you just believe that the aliens are starting the wildfires and and you using this with hatred, and you don't want diversity. I mean, like, this is serious issues. Your brain is malfunctioning. So there's a difference, okay? Like, for real. I mean, like, come on, people. And then you have these idiot politicians that don't have an answer to take care of the people that put them in office to, do something to make our lives better. You know what they're talking about? Gas stoves, conspiracy theories. It is like ridiculous. It is the most, like, these fools have not said that, and then they, oh God, they just come out with lies after lies, and they will lie to your face. They don't even care. They get on the news and just lie. Like they man, sometimes it totally enrages me how anybody could follow these people, how anybody could vote for these people. Because they're not helping you. They help and enrage your most terrible, sad grievances. And a lot of people walk around with mental illnesses. This shit is not cool. And they may hear a message from these idiots that say, go and kill them. Go and do that. You get a lot of people going to jail. You got a lot of people going to jail because of words that comes out of these fools' mouths. They don't care about these people going to jail. They don't care. Everything is political theater. Political damn theater.
Every day we go about our lives driven by routine.
Of the people I've known in my lifetime, he came as close to that combination that I see in Lincoln historically as anybody I've ever seen. Of someone who could be just as egalitarian in the practice of his politics, but just as political in his pursuit of equality. That's something that John Lewis had, and Abe Lincoln. Very different men, very different people in many ways, but they had that in common. Lincoln comes out of Kentucky, and he comes into Indiana and Southern Illinois. The world there is racist speeches everywhere. Racist speeches everywhere where I was growing up too. This is America we're talking about, but it's just sort of around, and so he's going to pick up on that, particularly when he's giving speeches to get elected. He's going to be flattering the crowd, and he knows out there that if you use certain words, they won't be objected to. No, they make you familiar to the crowd. My favorite example, not my favorite example, but the worst example of this actually was a speech that he gave in 1852 in support of Winfield Scott, which is not exactly think of, but it's the 1852 presidential election, and he makes a kind of weird racialist. It's not racist, but it is racist remark about Franklin Pierce of all people, accusing Franklin Pierce of being a mulatto in effect in his politics. Now, that's not the nastiest term, but it's pretty nasty, pretty ugly. I think that after 1854, that really drops away in Lincoln's speeches. It does drop away because I think that again, it's a measure of how slavery has taken over American politics. So that now I don't want to exaggerate his racism beforehand. It's there. It's not the forefront of his politics by any means. He's not a racist politician in the way that Stephen Douglas was. And in fact, if you want to, get the measure of Lincoln's anti-racism, match him up against Stephen Douglas, and you'll see it right away. So, as you said, Jackie, casual. It's casual. It's that kind of, what white guys said in those days. If you're from Illinois, but never at the forefront of what he was talking about. He was even in the 1830s, for example, in the Illinois state legislature, when the legislature wants to, censure the abolitionists, for example, and do so in ways that are pretty racist. He does not go along with that. He doesn't see that. So when it comes to the core of the principle of the matter, that's not part of his lexicon. But he is of the time and the place that he's from, and it'd be interesting to go back and look at everyday political speech. I'm sure scholars have, and I just haven't read it.
I want to stop it there. To DJ's question that he asked me, I thought I answered it. But here's an example what he was just saying. I'm sorry, said, Joy, do you think Lincoln didn't care about slavery to begin with? He just wanted to be president and he brought new things to influence for his own benefit. And I answered that. And what I was talking about was morals. And here this guy is again speaking about him like when you're a politician, there are things that you might say but you really don't believe in. There are some things that you might say to get elected or just when it's like reading a crowd. You look at these people and of course you're in a difficult situation. Because if you think the only way that you can get elected and make a change, because if you do not get elected, you cannot make change. So you may have to do a little bit of this or that. But stay core to your morals. And then it's gone. These are some of the things that politicians face all the time. You got some politicians that will say the most ridiculous racist things. And then when you call them out on it, oh, I adopted black kids. Yeah. And they do this. It is stupid, but politics is like that. I hear a lot of times about people talking about President Obama. Oh, he didn't do this. He didn't do that. Okay, well, President Obama, people need to realize is that he's the first fucking black president. And with a whole bunch of old fucking hillbilly fucking racist ass motherfuckers in Congress. They wasn't gonna let him pass shit. This is why President Obama, in order to get anything, he couldn't get shit through unless he sucked their dinglings. He did executive orders just to have some shit on the books. And black people, he didn't do that. What do you think he was gonna do? Get off your ass and go to work. Get off your ass and fucking vote. Vote these crazy ass people out. This is your first black president. Oh, I heard so many stories. Oh, they're gonna kill him. I'm like, that dude connected. Ain't no motherfucker gonna touch him. He just wasn't able to do what he wanted to do. And I'm sure he wanted to do. He's met with all these dirty racist motherfuckers. He gotta negotiate. And if he can't negotiate, he's like, fuck it, let me do some executive orders. Then all those motherfuckers criticize him for it. Even the fucking people. He's brand new. He's black on top of that. If that wasn't enough for these fucking old white motherfuckers, y'all be getting shit fucked up because you believe every fucking thing you hear and you know nothing about the fucking history. You're not fucking, you don't watch this shit go down every day. You just hear a little something. Oh, he didn't do that. Oh, she didn't do that. And then you take it and run with it and keep it in your feeble fucking small minds. And then one bullshit goes to the next, the next, the next. And you don't even fucking know what you're actually angry for. Because you don't know shit that happened. In the first beginning, you just heard some shit. Oh, that motherfucker didn't do this. Because some idiot or some of those fuckers that in those politicians say the shit. Oh, and you believe that shit. Because you don't, too fucking lazy to do the research. And I'm like, oh, look at this shit. And they're doing the same fucking thing again. They're doing, wait a minute. They're doing the same shit right now. They don't like Biden. Biden is actually getting shit done. What are they doing for you? What simple, you know all those hearings they're having? God damn, I cannot believe people are just like, oh my God, it is like, use your eyes and your fucking ears and believe what the fuck you see and hear. Just look at it. But no, people don't do that. What they do is let some loudmouth, guilty ass, indicted fuck. Oh, let's go, let's go.
What everyday speech was like, among white men in those parts of the country, or any part of the country for that matter. Its casualness, in fact, might be the measure of its relative unimportance in trying to understand the man. In Springfield, for example, people don't realize this.
Oh my God, DJ.
There were a lot of black families in Springfield, Illinois in the 1840s.
I love this. Okay, DG. That was a misspoke that Biden did. Yeah, I swear a lot, respectfully, because I can. DG, this is for 18 years and older, my channel is. And you're going to hear some swearing. I have gotten better in 2 years. So, if it bothers you, I don't know. I think maybe I have closed caption. But you're asking questions. So, I'm going to try to answer them to the best of my ability since you're here. So, let's let everybody know why he asked me. JOW, okay, just call me JW, or Joy, like when you first come in. So, evidently, you know who I am. Please explain to me, Trump saying black people vote for me, what to lose. And explain to me Biden saying if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. What is that difference? It is okay. You have a past. I have a past. Oh, don't say respectfully. I hate when people use these things because it really don't mean shit. It just means that you're throwing shade at somebody and then you want to put respectfully behind it. That is not respect. Okay? I just want you to know that. So, when that came about, I think, I'm not sure because I ain't really look at it because I thought it was all bullshit. Anyways, so yeah, respectfully, I thought it was all bullshit. And so Biden is saying, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. What is the difference? What I think Biden was trying to say is that most black people, I don't know what that was. I don't know what he was referring to, and I think he was referring to something else. And there was an explanation, but I promise you I'll find out what it was. But it wasn't like how they presented it. It was something else. That's what they put up there. You know, the media have a lot to do with bullshit too, respectfully. So we're gonna move on. And Trump saying black people vote for me. What do they have to lose? Well, he says that right out of his mouth, and there's really nothing attached to it because he's trying to get the black vote. And respectfully, black people used to be Republicans, as we spoke about that, okay? And some black people stay Republicans. And so, for the most part, it's more, I think, a demographic thing. It's just like a change of times. Times is went on and on and on. So, respectfully, DG, don't be playing with me, baby. Let's get back.
1850s. In fact, right by his neighbor, he does not live in the the fancy part of town. He lives in he's got a nice house. He's got a good lawyer's house. But there are black people coming in and out of that neighborhood. In that neighborhood, his neighbors. He's got black neighbors, and there's no sense of him being at all uncomfortable, being in any way upset by this. This struck him as normal. So I think that in understanding Lincoln's relationship to black people, those references I think are not particularly indicative of him. And then later on, of course, when he does befriend Frederick Douglass, when Sojourner Truth does come to the White House, they're struck by the fact that people talk about fragility, that white people can't talk to black people. It's a difficult thing. They're struck, in fact, by how open and honest and unbothered he was by the fact of race. And this is in 1860, 62, 63, 64, when it's a very different America than we have today. So I'm not making him out to be some sort of paragon of virtue of any kind. But I do think that Lincoln's see where Lincoln was from, and you get a sense of where he ended up. And I think that's important. That's not to say that he evolved. He didn't have to go through these sudden changes that I think some historians think that he went through. I don't think there were two Lincolns. I think there was one Lincoln. The Lincoln that you saw at the end was the Lincoln that you began with. But it's a person who's evolved.
Fugitive Slave Act.
As part of the Compromise of 1850, Congress passes a Fugitive Slave Act, which is the most draconian of its kind. There had been an earlier one in 1793, and it basically turns the entire North into a slave patrol. It says that you will be fined, you will be punished if you do not help to run down fugitive slaves. Now, this went far beyond what the Constitution called for, but it was constitutional. You see, it was not something that was, clearly unconstitutional. It was just bad policy in Lincoln's terms. Now, the reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act in the North is ferocious. There are any number of incidents in the North where fugitive slaves who were supposed to be brought back are rescued or are protected by northern anti-slavery Northerners. In some cases, scooted up to Canada, gotten away, taken away. There was a very famous incident in 1854 where an escaped slave named Anthony Burns was tracked down in Boston and was supposed to be returned to the South. And there was a huge hue and cry in Boston, of all places, which was kind of the center of radical abolitionism. And the president of the United States, Franklin Pierce, actually had to call up federal troops to accompany this one man, to make sure that this one man was taken back to the South into slavery. And those troops did indeed march Anthony Burns to the docks, but the streets were filled with people protesting. So the Fugitive Slave Act, it gave birth to Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most important anti-slavery piece of, writing probably in the entire period. What was Lincoln's reaction? Lincoln's reaction was, this is a terrible thing. I don't like the Fugitive Slave Act, but it's constitutional. It's not unconstitutional. There is that fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. I respect the Constitution, and this is important to understand. Any understanding of Lincoln is his reverence for both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And he says, we can't say that it's unconstitutional. Now, we got to get rid of it. We've got to elect people who are going to get rid of it. But I...
Okay, I'm going to pause this. So I'm going to try and answer DG because he has you're very, very... I'm going to try and answer that. But there was a thing that went on with New Mexico. They had some kind of... I don't know. I have to get back with that. And like I said before, they had a lot of slavery going on there at the time. And they was going through that revolution. And it may not have all stemmed from slavery, but just the injustices. And I think that that's probably why a lot of Latinos are Republicans. I think they're just still like a lot of black people are Republicans. I think it wasn't a changeover. This is what their ancestors were. This is what their family were. And they just never changed. So, I don't know. I really don't know about that. But I do know it was kind of terrible. They had some shit about land and a whole lot of things going on. And so, I don't understand whether Latinos are Republicans, but I mean, like, I think that could have something to do with it. And, you know, we got black Republicans. And I don't understand why they still Republicans, considering how the Republicans are today. They're not the conservative Republicans. They're MAGA. It's a fucking cult. And so they're still Republicans. And they still do stupid stuff and get locked up for these people. So, yes, I don't know. But I think it has something to do with some kind of revolution that they had going on there a long, long time ago. And it just never changed over. I think it's all demographics. So I tried to answer your question, but I will look into that. Because I want to know too. That's interesting. I want to know how there's still... I want to know how there's still Republicans I mean, why not independents? You know what I'm saying? But I will look into that.
Cannot stand with you on this, and disappointed a lot of anti-slavery people. It's one of the reasons why Wendell Phillips, the great abolitionist, later on was to refer to Abraham Lincoln as the slave hound of Illinois. The slave hound of Illinois. Because, you know, he was willing to go along with the constitutional character of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this is again getting back to Lincoln as politician. It's also Lincoln as statesman. In understanding that he thought that the Constitution of the United States was a great thing, and that the Constitution of the United States did have anti-slavery potential. Indeed, he devotes an entire speech at Cooper Union to explaining why the Constitution of the United States had this great anti-slavery potential. And he did not want to see the Constitution of the United States undone. If getting rid of slavery meant getting rid of the Constitution of the United States, well, you know, what we're going to be left with? You know, we wouldn't be left with a country. We would have been left with chaos. Or we could have been left with a monarchy. And who knows what direction that would have gone in, because they always said that slavery was the instantiation of the divine right of kings anyway. So he didn't see that as a solution. He saw that as a setback. He also believed that the Declaration of Independence was organically connected with the Constitution. And he believed that the line that, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that was at the core of his political beliefs. And he believed that that was instantiated in the Constitution. And when you read the preamble of the Constitution, you can understand why. So, going back to the Fugitive Slave Act, you know, his understanding of the Constitution was that it was You know, it wasn't unconstitutional. Um, People misunderstood what he was talking about. People thought that he was soft on the Fugitive Slave Act. He wasn't soft on the Fugitive Slave Act. He was strong on the Constitution, and he had to try to find a way to get rid of slavery without getting rid of the Constitution. Now, you know, the southern slaveholders wouldn't let him do that because they seceded. He gets elected with the Democratic election, and you know, they won't let him go about it the way that he thought it could be gotten done, because they saw the writing on the wall. They knew very well what he was up to, he and his party.
Lincoln's misunderstood anti-slavery
And
commitment.
I think Lincoln gets misunderstood because people think that his devotion is to the Union rather than to getting rid of slavery. People think that his devotion is to the Constitution rather than to getting rid of slavery. He's devoted to both. He's devoted to both. When the Southern secession comes, he realizes that he can't do anything about slavery until the Union is restored. There's no way for him to do anything about slavery until the Union is restored. That's why it's the number one thing. Now, does that mean he's, you know, that this is a war that's going to be, you know, that doesn't care about slavery? No, he was elected on a platform to get rid of slavery. Now, you know, when he talks about the Union as it was, that means the Union as it was would be elected to get rid of slavery. But he couldn't fight that war. He couldn't go about getting rid of slavery.
I get this. Mr. Tennessee Williams, wake up, woman. What up? Your salute. You know what? Where is my child support? I want it and I want it now. And don't tell me you ain't got it. Because evidently, you've been working. I have not heard from you. But of course, I have not been on social media either. But I want my child support, Mr. Tennessee. Where is it? You're such a dog. You always come in with your BS. I forget it in his. Hoffa's dead, asshole. Where was Jimmy Hoffa got it in his pocket? You're such an ass. I swear to God, I cannot stand you. I will go and get it out of. As far as I know, they cannot find Hoffa. Maybe it was cut up in so many pieces and thrown away. Oh, they trying to hide your shit. I'm just gonna hide that shit. You know what? You need to stop talking shit when you want me. I already got it started. So stop your madness. Message. Oh, Jimmy, I forgot this part. Well, you need to go and get it. Ain't no LOL. You need to go and. Yeah, what is that? Or asking a child support.
Slavery, or starting to, but he's.
This is my fake baby daddy, and he owes me child support, DJ. Since you have to know. Anyways, my fake baby daddy has not paid me child support since I had the baby. Yeah, he owes me child support. Let's get back to it. Tennessee what you doing? Hello. She's speaking another language to me. Hello. You know what? You know the language I'm speaking to you. You piece of nothing. You want to do a cup of Joe with me? Since you I don't think you're going to sleep no test. I don't know what she talking about. I mean, habla no English. Hombre, you know what?
Slavery is a
Okay, I'm trying to come back. Am I back? Am I back? Doesn't you know what, Kennedy? You a piece of shit. You am I back, DG? I'm back.
That if he was going to pursue his anti-slavery agenda, what he had been elected to do was not immediate emancipation by any means. It was going to be under the Constitution, but he was going to do it. That he had to save the Union. It was only as the war continued that he realized that he couldn't save the Union without the Emancipation Proclamation. That, you know, and a lot had happened in 1861-62. But by the end of 1862, he's clear that no, this is not the right choice now. It's not a matter of saving the Union in order to get rid of slavery. I'm going to have to emancipate. I'm going to have to proclaim emancipation if I want to save the Union. Things kind of flipped.
I don't know.
But that's all the dynamic of the war. I mean, that's the dynamic of what happened with him that I think is terribly misunderstood. In part because, you know, I mean, there are as many representations of Abraham Lincoln in history as there were political representations of Abraham Lincoln in his own lifetime. You know, I mean, there were neo-Confederate versions of Abraham Lincoln. There are neo-Copperhead versions of Lincoln. There are neo-Garrisonian versions of Lincoln, all of which give you a view of Lincoln, but it's not necessarily Lincoln. Now, I'm not saying that you should take the Lincolnian view of Lincoln. What I'm trying to say is that they are partial. And on this thing in particular, the idea that the Union was not, all him and slavery was not, why would he have even run for president as a Republican? Why, when all these compromises are being proposed to save the Union in 1861, 1861
I don't know if
there's
you're
all these compromise
still...
proposals, the Crittenden Compromise, this compromise, that compromise. Save the Union, save the Union. He says, no. He says, the tug must come here. Slavery will be stopped from going into the territories. Full stop. That's it. No compromise. Now, that was about slavery. That was the way he thought that slavery was going to eventually come to an end. It wasn't the express, it was the local. Okay, but we were on that train. He was principled about that, absolutely, in a way that many Republicans were not. He was absolutely principled about that. So from the beginning, the Civil War was always a war about slavery. The question was, how are you going to get there? And in Lincoln's mind, you know, a dissevered Union could not be tolerated. Could not be tolerated. But it was a dissevered Union that was going to be put back together again so that he could then go about doing what he could to get rid of slavery. That often gets, you know, the neo-Garrisonian view doesn't agree with that. Although by the end of the war, Garrison did, which is sort of interesting, because by the end of the war, you know, Garrison and Lincoln have actually converged, and Garrison kind of sees the point. Garrison actually supports Lincoln for re-election in 1864, which a lot of the abolitionists, many of the abolitionists, did not. So it's interesting that Garrison's, you know, latter-day admirers don't always see what Garrison himself saw. But these are the politics of the 1850s going into the 1860s, the politics of the war. And, you know, unless we understand the anti-slavery origins of the Civil War, that there really were anti-slavery origins to the Civil War. If you're going to say that slavery didn't cause the Civil War, institutions don't cause wars. Slavery didn't cause it. Anti-slavery caused the Civil War. Slavery had been around for thousands of years. Anti-slavery was the new thing. That was the challenge. And it was kind of there during the Revolution, but then it got buried, then it got pushed aside, but it came back. And it came back with, you know, to the point where in 1860 it won national power. this was extraordinary. But that's why the war happened. The war didn't happen because of slavery. The war did not come about because of slavery. The war came about because Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. That's why the war happened. Well, that's why secession happened, and then the war came after. And that's the anti-slavery cause of the Civil War, because Abraham Lincoln, by 1861, embodied the anti-slavery cause. Not every anti-slavery person agreed with that. There are always divisions, but in terms of national power, that was very true. And by misunderstanding that, we not only misunderstand Abraham Lincoln, but we misunderstand the central event in American history, if we get that wrong. Lincoln is elected in November 1860, and by December 20th, the state of South Carolina had a sense of mortality about him, and you can see that in various aspects of his life. But I think he was confronting the sacrifice that had been made on such a massive scale, and he tried to put that together. He tried to bring together what the purposes of the war actually were, and to do so, to explain the sacrifice and to honor that sacrifice in a way that went beyond really anything he'd actually said before. He had had quite the occasion to do this. He had annual messages and so forth, but really this was a different kind of occasion. That's what he did, and that's what he did at Gettysburg. To announce, no surprise, but still it had to be said that this was a new birth of freedom, that the American Revolution was being reborn in this war, in this great titanic struggle, but that the war stood, in the end, for democracy itself, and that the two went together. As I said, there's always been the central problem of American history. Had always been, how could this democratic republic deal with slavery and its legacy? And that struggle over that is the struggle of American history. At Gettysburg, it came to a head, and he put them both together. That the salvation, the vindication of democracy requires a new birth of freedom, and that the new birth of freedom goes hand in hand with the salvation, the vindication of democracy. The two are there. That's what I think Gettysburg does, in an extraordinary way. I mean, insofar as Lincoln's idea, that the fundamental idea of the United States of America was in the Declaration. It was the proposition that all men are created equal, that is to say, human equality. If that's the center of the whole thing, if that's it, here we are. This is the moment, and that's what these men died for. And we will continue. We will continue the struggle. I mean, you can read the Gettysburg Address as a perennial, as everlasting, because the struggle really isn't over. You can read it today and say, we're still here, President Lincoln. We're still fighting. And that's what gives it its timelessness, I think. And many more people have had to die in that struggle. But we're going to keep it going. And we're going to keep it going just the way you did it. Because we understand that freedom is about the vindication of America. That America does stand for something. And if we can fight that fight, as you understood it, as you helped us understand, we'll have lived to a noble purpose. That's Gettysburg. Frederick Douglass is a great man. Frederick Douglass is a great abolitionist, and Frederick Douglass actually had broken with Garrison on the question of the Constitution. So, but he's a radical. He's an agitator. He's the radical, and whereas Lincoln's the Republican. So there's a kind of division of labor here, There's the radical agitator, and there's the political leader, the politician, the president. Now, that's going to lead to possibilities of convergence, but most of the time it's going to lead to all kinds of conflict. And it can lead in both ways. And that's certainly led in both ways in the case of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln gives his first inaugural address, and Frederick Douglass reviews it and kind of gives it a pan. I mean, he really hated it. He just said, honest Abe, there's no honest here. He's dragged the Constitution to the gutter. He's talking about all this stuff. He's not talking about getting rid of slavery, which is what was important to him. Well, Abraham Lincoln was going to talk about that because he wanted to try to keep the Union together at that moment. Slavery wasn't the issue that he was going to be talking about. It didn't get off to a great start. Let's put it that way. Thereafter, I sometimes say, Frederick Douglass is always getting ticked off at Abraham Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln isn't doing enough. And so he goes into the White House and he's going to show, give the president a piece of his mind. And it was a great mind to be giving him a piece of. So it was a lot there. And he always goes in and he always leaves saying, he's so great. He's such a wonderful guy. This president, this Abraham Lincoln, now part of that had to do with the way that Lincoln treated a black man, which was, how many been slaves had been in the White House. Not a whole lot of people like Frederick Douglass. Simple respect was part of it. But it was also, I think, that Lincoln could bring out in Douglass the logic of what he was doing. He helped Douglass understand what he was doing, that he wasn't being dilatory, that he had a reason for doing what he was doing. So Douglass would come away, wow, this is great. And then he'd forget about all of that. And he'd go back with his radical friends and he'd get ticked off again. So that in 1864, he's actually backing, he's not backing Lincoln for the presidency. He's backing Fremont along with the other radicals. Goes back to the White House. And he has another conversation with President Lincoln and with Secretary of War Stanton. And they talk about deputizing, in effect, Frederick Douglass to go and bring more slaves, more enslaved, runaways to the Union lines to help organize. He thinks of it as the John Brown plot. Well, it's not exactly that, but it's, he's going to make, this is a military thing. And he's so happy. He's going to, now, it didn't happen because in the end, Sherman took Atlanta and the war took a different course, and that wasn't necessary. But then their final meeting is the most extraordinary one because there's been this back and forth. Right? The radical pushing the president, he's not doing enough. He's just another politician. The president saying, here's this great man, but God, he's giving me such headaches. I'm going to try and bring him over to my side. He does for a time. But then comes the final meeting, which is extraordinary because this is on March 4th, 1865. And Lincoln has just delivered the second inaugural. And you remember the second inaugural is the speech where he actually takes the full measure of slavery and the war, or attempts to. The war is not over yet. The war is still continuing. It's pretty clear that the Union's going to win, but it's not over by a long shot. And he talks about how, if there must be one drop of blood drawn by the sword for every drop of blood drawn by the lash, we will pay that price. Now that's pretty heavy. And people remember actually the bind up the nation wounds and, charity for all, malice towards uncharity for all part of the speech, which is important. But there's also the full understanding of slavery and the war. At any rate, so Lincoln gives a speech and it's Inauguration Day. They go back to the White House. They're going to have a big reception. Frederick Douglass shows up for the reception. And the white guards see Frederick Douglass and they say, well, this black guy's not getting in. So they stop him from getting in. And then eventually he manages to get his way into the East Room of the White House, big reception. Lincoln sees him in the back of the crowd coming in and he says, there's my friend Douglass. I want to speak to my friend Douglass. Right? Now, it's nothing. People can make him out, what a great guy. There's nothing especially noble about this. It's just that he's treating this person as a person, as his friend. Now, he's being a politician too, because, 6 months earlier, Douglass was after his hide. here comes my friend Douglas. And he brings him to the, calls him forth, comes him forward. And he says to him, what did you think of that speech? I really want to know what you thought of that speech. I really care what you thought of that speech. To which Douglas says, it was a sacred effort, sir. It was a sacred effort. And that's the last meeting between the two of them. And, 5 weeks later, Lincoln's dead. But what I think we see in that relationship is a convergence of the radical and the president. In American politics, people misunderstand this a lot, that there is a division of labor. And when it works, when American politics works, when change really happens, is when the forces of equality, egalitarianism, understand what politicians have to put up with, and when politicians have to understand what the egalitarians have to put up with. And, when it really can work, and I suppose we've seen it in American history, we've seen it during the New Deal, we saw it. We certainly saw it in the 60s. That moment when Lyndon Johnson actually gives a speech where he says, "We shall overcome," and Dr. King, weeps. That's the moment of convergence. That's how things get done. That doesn't mean it's going to be, it's not all going to be lemonade and twinkle toes. It's not all going to be happy. It can't be happy. It shouldn't be happy. But each side has to understand the other and get it, understand it. That's politics in a way. I mean, the greatest reformers, the greatest egalitarians have been the ones who were also politicians, who understand politics. I was talking about John Lewis earlier. He's an example of that. But I think Dr. King was that way as well. And, and by Rustin and those guys. I mean, people who understood that politicians have to be understood, not just, denigrated. Because if you want to get anything done, you got to get, they're the ones who are going to get it done. Politicians likewise have to understand that, the forces of change are unruly. The forces of change are not, going to be there to kiss your butt. They're going to be there to fight you because things need changing and you're in the way, sort of, until you can prove that you're not. Now, Lyndon Johnson could understand that. I think John Kennedy sort of began to understand that. Certainly his brother understood that, came to understand that. Robert Kennedy understood that. The people at the Justice Department understood that, the Civil Rights Division. They understood that. In America, and it doesn't always happen, but the extraordinary moments when that happens. So what I'm saying is really that Douglas and Lincoln are an example of that. I mean, it's not as if Douglas is the leader of a movement. He's not. He is a spokesman for a point of view. Because the abolitionist movement, while it continued, it was still out there. It wasn't the same as it had been before the war, before the Republican Party came on. So it's it's not exactly the same. But Douglas is the great spokesman of Black abolitionism, of Black America in many ways at that point. And it was not easy, but I think that they both show the capacity to understand one another. They came to understand where they were in this struggle, and and so I think that's where historically that's what their importance, what the importance of that relationship is, and something we can take from it, not just historically, but in our own lives. Which is, again, it's not being wussy. It's not giving anybody a break. You can't give anybody a break, but you have to understand where they're coming from in the political system. And, I mean, it is remarkable how people can, this is what being a politician in part is about, is that you don't take things personally. And you understand where the person who's, even if he's really your enemy, or if he's your ally who thinks he's your enemy, you have to understand where they're standing, why they're standing where they're standing. And if you can understand that, then you can act with wisdom. And that was certainly something that Lincoln gained, and I think Douglas did too. the question of what was going to happen racially after emancipation went all the way back to the 18th century. People were wondering, if we are getting rid of slavery, what's going to happen? Are we going to be able to coexist? Are the races going to be able to coexist harmoniously or not? And most white people, and Thomas Jefferson's a good example, but I mean, not alone, thought that was impossible. Not because they thought that black people were terrible, although Jefferson's not particularly, which we say, noble in this regard, but because there was a belief that after all that had happened, it was impossible to imagine a biracial society. There was some that was about black inferiority, that blacks are inferior to whites, and we have to have this, get them out of here. We have to have this beautiful white society, and there's that racist reason. There was also the reason jumping off along the way, and how at every stop, African Americans were, the most, or among the most grief-stricken. And this actually goes back to even before he was shot in Richmond. When he goes to Richmond, he comes to Richmond, it's the African American community. It's the blacks, former slaves now, and who flocked to him. He was really thought of as an emancipator. He really was. And so his death on Good Friday, I mean, it's so redolent with Christian imagery, and it's almost, you can't believe it. You can't believe it's true. And I think for the African American communities, all these places, it was unbounded grief. And what's to come? What's to come of us? I mean, we just got freedom. Who's this guy, Andrew Johnson? It's not as if it was a sure thing. But I think that just the great love of Lincoln was on display. In the South, there were some who kind of got it, who said, "This is a terrible thing. This is a terrible thing for us," because they saw that Lincoln's martyrdom could only encourage, the radicals in the North to come down even harder against the South. I mean, here they were. They just, done this, they just lost this war, and I mean, imagine, say, that some German had bumped off FDR, right at the end of World War II, and you're a German. You're thinking, oh no, this is not going to be good. Well, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but you see what I'm saying. So some Southerners got that, but there were plenty of Southerners who thought, finally, that was the last act of the Civil War, and they won. They won. Sic semper tyrannis. I mean, I got down south a fair amount, not that much, but some. And you can still see people selling T-shirts, Sic semper tyrannis on it. I mean, that act established a legacy, a poisonous legacy that is still very much with us. And it's there. It's not just in the South, but it's really deep in the South, the white South. So there were plenty of people real happy. I think, look at Mary Boykin Chestnut's diary. I mean, I think she says some rather choice words about the demise of the president that she'd come to despise. I mean, Lincoln had freed the slaves, as far as they were concerned. This was the undoing of everything that they believed was wholly Christian and American. This man was responsible for it. Frederick Douglass, all those, he was the man responsible. So there was plenty of, celebration. And I don't have the stories in front of me, but you can find them. I mean, there's plenty of stories of Southerners. I mean, it's funny, the Lincoln image in the Southern mind, because by the time you get to D.W. Griffith, by the time you get to Birth of a Nation, right, Lincoln's a good guy. Because Lincoln was the guy who was going to spare them the horrors of Reconstruction. He was going to be, malice towards none, charity for all. So, Lincoln kind of gets reabsorbed in the Republican and the Southern white imagination. Not that there's any one Southern white imagination, you know what I'm saying, but in that part of the imagination, he gets reabsorbed as a good guy. So everybody can like Abraham Lincoln. But at the time, no, he was, the man responsible for your son's death, it was a war. and it wasn't just about, it wasn't it was, yes, it was about slavery, but it was a war too, and people had suffered and died, and people had seen their entire, if you're along Sherman's march, you're pretty ticked off, but you're ticked off at Sherman, but you're also ticked off at Lincoln. You're not so happy you're not so sad to see that somebody bumped him off, because of what had happened to you. This is the ones, America, Civil War was the one war until recently, but at least up until Vietnam, it's the one war that Americans lost. But it wasn't every American, it was just some Americans. And the White South is, that's still a theme in understanding, big theme in understanding, American history, let alone the history of the South. And Lincoln's death is part of all of that. Look at the photographs. The photographs of the I'm thinking about the North now. The photographs of the crowds and it's a bit like, those of us of a certain age, it's a bit like, reliving what we went through in 1963, to see the crowds lined up. He was just taken across to Arlington. He wasn't shipped out to Boston or something. But the feeling that this can't be happening, and it is, and kind of stunned. And even more, I think, in Lincoln's case, much more in Lincoln's case, because it had come after the war. It was the last act of the Civil War. To think that at the moment of absolute glory, not just for a man, but for a whole cause, at a moment of absolute glory, of absolute fulfillment. The day that he died, or maybe the day before, he was riding around in his carriage with his wife, and he was just feeling, I am so happy now, finally. It is done. It is done. That's a personal thing, but the entire country was feeling that way. The South one way, and the North another. It's beyond Shakespeare. It's beyond any kind of example you can name of tragedy. Whitman tried to write about it, wrote about it beautifully in When Lilacs Last on the Door, in the Dooryard Bloomed. And he makes the point in that poem, actually, that I was trying to make very poorly, which is that he moves from the death, the ceremonies for Lincoln's death, and the flambeaux, the fire at night as people were, trying to see the coffin, but then moves out over all the dead in the war, and the carnage of the war, and then eventually comes to these, the symbols, the thrush and the drooping star, and death it was the embodiment, if you will, of death as an aspect of life, and it took someone of Whitman's imagination to make clear just how profound that event was, going even beyond the Civil War, going to the depths of our humanity. It was. It is still. Go to Ford's Theater sometime. Just you're eternally at the moment where you want to just stand at that door and keep that guy from getting in there, and stop it. Just stop it. But you can't. Even historians can't do that. But you want to. You want to, or you want to say, don't go. Don't go to the theater tonight. Stay home. Stay home with your wife. Have a good time. There's always this moment where you think you can undo these events, and it's only because it's so profound. It's so much deeper than even history. Sic semper tyrannis is the motto of the state of Virginia, and it means ever thus to tyrants. And it's not altogether clear whether Booth actually said this, but there were witnesses who said at the time in the theater that after he jumped out of the box, and he may have hurt his leg then, maybe not, doesn't matter, that he brandished the knife that he had used to slice open Major Rathbone's arm, that he held up his knife and muttered the words, or uttered the words, Sic Semper Tyrannis, which would be a perfectly, in character, on stage, John Wilkes Booth, bit of dramatism, bit of dramatics, rather. It would be a perfect John Wilkes Booth dramatics, because that's what he was doing. It was for the world. So that's what it means. Ever thus to tyrants. And yes, when you can go. Last time where was I? I think it was in South Carolina. I was at a barbecue joint, and they're selling Sic Semper Tyrannis, T-shirts, with a picture of Booth shooting the president. I didn't buy one, but I should have. I should have bought one. Just I don't care whether the money was going to go to somebody anyway. Just as an example, just to remind people what it's still like down there, because that was only 10 years ago. So that's what it means.
This is a dog.
Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis sent a powerful letter to MAGA Republican Jim Jordan, telling Jordan to stop interfering with her RICO criminal case in Fulton County. And if he wants to learn about the role of what prosecutors do and the separation of powers and federalism and what a RICO case, well, he can pay the fee for non-members of the state bar because he's not a licensed lawyer. That's the fee of $249. And